we're going to look at inverse functions. Before we get into them, let's go ahead and cover the basics and the definition. So with inverse functions, if putting x or our inputs into a function gives us the result of y or our outputs, then applying the inverse function would reverse or swap the input and output values. And what that means is if I had a point x, y, and I put it into the inverse, then it would be swapped to be yx. To look at an example with numerical values, if we had the point -5, 2, and I plugged it in, then my inverse would just switch my x and my y and become 2, -5. And what's happening graphically here is inverse functions are reflected over the line of y equals x. So when they reflect over the line of y equals x, they just switch places. So here we have the ordered pair 2, 1. So when I switch my x and my y values, it becomes 1, 2. And when I put it on my graph, I can see that it is just reflected over my line here of y equals x. So this happens for all inverse functions and inverse points. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at an actual inverse function and answer some questions. So here we have the original function, f of x equals x to the third minus 1. And the question says, if x equals 1 is the input for f of x, what would be the corresponding point that would fall on the graph of the inverse? So what we need to do is we need to take this input of x equals 1 and plug it in. And when I simplify that, I get 0. So on my original graph, I have this point of 1, 0. So on my inverse, so if I do my inverse now, what I'm going to end up with is 0, 1. Right, because y and x switch places. Now for this next question, it says, would the point -9, -2 fall on the graph of f inverse of x? Well, the first way we're going to look at doing this is, to know if it's going to fall on the graph f inverse of x, I need to find my inverse function. So if we start with our original, I need to write the orders that x is being operated on. So the first thing that happens to x is it is cubed. And then the second thing is we subtract 1. So now I can write the inverse function, which is going to have me go with the opposite order in the opposite operation. So I'm going to go opposite order, opposite operation. So instead of subtracting 1 last, that's actually going to become my first step, and I'm going to do the opposite and add 1. And the opposite of cubing is cube root, which I'm just going to abbreviate with CVRT. And now I can write my inverse function. So f inverse of x equals, we'll start with x, add 1, and then I'm going to cube root all of x minus 1. So now that I have my inverse function, I can plug in, okay, -9's my input. I need to figure out, does that equal -2? Well, let's go ahead and plug it in. So f inverse of -9 equals the cubed root of -9 plus 1. Sorry, that should be a 1. Simplify it again. I end up with the cube root of negative 8, which does give me negative 2. So this point here of negative 9, negative 2 would fall on the graph, f inverse of x. So again, just to highlight, we started over here with our original and writing the steps. Then the second thing we did is we wrote our inverse function. And then the third thing we did is we substituted my input of negative 9 in to verify if I got my output of negative 2. Okay, another way to think about it is if I have the point of negative 9, negative 2, that means the input and the output are going to be negative 9 and negative 2, respectively, for my inverse. What you can do is you can go ahead and you can reverse, you can swap your input and output if you want. And then verify using the original equation. So to verify using the original equation, if negative 2 is going to be my input for my original, then my output for my original should be negative 9. Notice when I substitute negative 2 in, when I put it into my function, I end up with negative 9. So I do end up here with inverse points. So negative 9, negative 2 does fall on the graph of f inverse of x. So two different ways, right here for 2 and 3, to go about the same process. Choose whichever way makes the most sense to you and you feel comfortable with, and go ahead and try the practice problems on the next page.